Hello people, and welcome to a new type of video. Today we are going to tier all of the public transport methods available to us in City Skylines. Of course, these opinions are all based on my own personal opinion with the game, so if you feel maybe I've misranked something, placed it too high or too low, please do feel free to get down in the comments below and let me know. But otherwise, let's get started, shall we? So by far and away, the worst method of public transport, in my opinion, in the game is blimps. We're going to rank this at D tier. So in terms of a realism point of view, if I can find one person in the comments that has taken a blimp anywhere in the last 3 years, then I'll be proved immediately wrong. But otherwise, the assets are really hard to place and they look kind of ridiculous floating around the sky, especially when you know that there's people using them as public transport. I am not aware of any public transport system in the world that is still using blimps to transport the public around. That could be wrong. Again, if it is, do let me know down in the comments below. Each blimp will only carry 35 people, which is only 5 more than a bus, and in general, they just look kind of ridiculous floating around the city. Their depot asset can work quite nicely alongside an airport build, and there is also a policy in the game called educational blimps, which slightly increases the education in your city. This policy is actually quite useful for pushing a campus up to that final level if you're struggling for student numbers, but other than that, blimps for me, I never ever use them unless it's for that little education push. But again, if you have a different experience with them, please let me know. Next up, I'm also going to place taxis in D tier as well, which could potentially be controversial. These assets are actually quite useful around commercial specialised areas, including tourism and nightlife, and you'll definitely get the most use out of them there. And it's actually very rare you'll even see people utilising the taxi stands. At least in my experience, I've never really seen at all that many people waiting at the taxi stand asset. Sims can actually also wait at the taxi depot, but because this asset is usually placed further away from these specialised areas, you'll very rarely, if ever, see people waiting at these things. Their assets are nice from a decoration perspective, both the depot and the stand. The stand works really nice alongside commercial, and you can actually use it as kind of a aesthetic bus stop as well if you want that bus shelter vibe next to a bus stand. They can actually work quite nicely in that regard, but otherwise taxis in my experience isn't a massively fleshed out public transport mechanic, so for that reason alone I'm just going to put them in D tier. We'll now move into C tier, and the first method I'm going to place in here is actually going to be trolley buses. I was initially thinking of putting this in D because I really didn't like trolley buses when they were first introduced to the game with the Sunset Harbour DLC. However, I've found that they're actually better used as localized public transport loops, transporting people back and to from attractions to larger methods of public transport like train and metro. The real downside to them is that they require their own specific type of road to travel on, and they hold exactly the same amount of people as buses, so there's no real upside to using them over a regular bus. And if you're going to use a dedicated type of road for public transport, then there's no real reason why you shouldn't be using trams instead of trolley buses, which of course hold 90 people instead of 30. From a decoration perspective, the trolley bus wires can be quite nice when run through certain areas, but definitely using them for localized loops is the way to go. You definitely don't want to rely on these things for moving huge amounts of people around, but they do have their place in the game. The next method of public transport in C tier is going to be helicopters. Very similar to blimps, they are another form of internal air travel, however they're much faster and cause less noise pollution, and their stops take up a lot less space than the blimps do. So for all those reasons mentioned, they're going to be a tier above the awful blimps. I hate the blimps. Whilst their capacity is fairly small for a method of public transport, and similar to trolley buses, you don't want to rely on these to move vast amounts of people around, they certainly have their place within the aesthetic point of the game. You can use them on piers. It's nice to see the helicopters coming and going near the water, and also near larger, more important buildings such as stadiums and perhaps your financial districts. They are quite a nice addition into the skyline, and they're also useful for getting over extreme terrain. If you have a very hilly or mountainous map and you're perhaps having difficulty running other methods of public transport through, or you don't have the road network that's suited for buses, then helicopters can be a nice compromise on that as well. So certainly a C tier method of public transport, definitely not lower and certainly not higher. The next method of public transport to fall into C tier is going to be ferries. Ferries are a little bit of a weird one, and of course are entirely useless if you have no rivers or coastline within your map. So if you're kind of within a landlocked map, ferries are almost entirely useless to you. And the reason they're falling into C tier and not B tier is because their capacity seems to be a little off. They only hold 50 people. For anyone that's ever been on a ferry in real life before, they're a lot bigger than that. So they're essentially water buses in that regard. Some of the transport hubs that actually use ferries are quite nice, and you can allow 2 of them to dock at the same time, but the regular ferry stops are really small and don't allow that many people to wait at them at once. And they're best used, again, very similar to trolley buses tied into other methods of public transport, either having buses, metro, trains or monorail stop nearby will certainly help you get more use out of the ferry lines, but I think just because they hold 50 people and the AI doesn't tend to favour them that much, they are going to fall into C tier. The first method into B tier is going to be the cable car from the Mass Transit DLC. So cable cars are a great aesthetic method of public transport and look really good climbing up mountains, which is where the majority of people end up using them. However, they're also good for crossing kind of bodies of water or rivers or seas, or even using them in your theme parks if you have the Park Life DLC. And the assets actually work really great as part of an amusement park build, which is something we will do on the channel fairly soon in Bavaria. But they run really often and allow a constant stream of passengers to be moved around. And similar to helicopters, they're also good for crossing difficult terrain with the way that the cable car lines behave. But for me, they're very much an aesthetic choice of public transport, look really good climbing up mountains. So for those reasons mentioned, they are going to fall as a B tier public transport. The next method of public transport into B tier is going to be buses. So certainly one of the more true to real life methods of public transport. Pretty sure every city in the world or most towns have a bus, right? And it's also the first one that we unlock in the game, so they're kind of the base foundation for most of our initial public transport systems. However, it's important that we do upgrade and continue to support them with other methods of public transport as we unlock stuff like trains and metro. Most of us in our early Cities Skylines days probably would have encountered a problem where there's literally hundreds, if not thousands of people waiting at a bus stop, which of course never happens in the real world. We also got a nice little biofuel bus depot with the Green Cities DLC, and we can also dive into the bus route information and actually change the model, which is a nice little bonus for the public transport. You can change it from the regular model, the biofuel bus, or indeed a school bus if you want. But for most cities, buses are pretty much a given and will form essentially the backbone of our public transport systems. They also have their own roads, which were added with the After Dark DLC, which can also help alleviate the pressure off the roads if there's maybe too many buses. Then giving them a dedicated lane on that road can help with that. But it's crucial that we support them with larger methods once they're unlocked. So buses, fairly common, nice and easy to use. They're going to fall into B tier for me. The next method of public transport into B tier is going to be Intercity Buses. Added with the Sunset Harbour DLC, I'm a huge fan of Intercity Buses, especially with their Intercity bus stops. They make really good buildings as part of a larger transport hub and also as part of highway rest stops. They're actually really fun to use in that capacity to drop people off near the highways and then get them into the inner city using other internal methods of public transport. It is the first way that we can get tourists into the city if you're playing through the milestones in the game. And there's also a nice little policy called Tourist Travel Card, which increases the use of the intercity buses over means of other transit, but it does boost the upkeep cost for these. Each intercity bus will hold 60 people, which isn't too bad, but for an external method of public transport, it is the smallest, so for that reason, I don't think it deserves to be any higher than B tier. The next and final method of public transport into B tier is going to be cruise ships, or cruise liners, whatever you want to call them. The only reason I'm placing them in B tier, not A tier, is because of, I guess, a graphical glitch in the game where the ships will undergo cell mitosis. It looks ridiculous, and I was kind of hoping it might have been patched out by now. And also, the cruise liners, they only hold 100 people, which is only 10 more than a tram, which is a little bit ridiculous. So you can kind of see where there's some problems with the scaling of the passengers between the different methods of public transport. It doesn't quite level out as it should. They're a good way of getting tourists into the city, but they absolutely need to be supported with other local internal methods of public transport because they're bringing in much heavier people, 100 people per ship, and you can often get 4 or 5 ships arriving at once. That's 500 people that are arriving all at once on the same road. So it's essential that we put metro, monorail, train right by them so the tourists can get around the city without having to drive. They're the second best way of bringing tourists into the city, and you don't have to worry about vehicles on the road like you do with intercity buses and getting them to their stop. Of course, they just sail on the water. Because of their relatively small passenger number for what the method of public transport is, and the way the game shows them, again, cell mitosis, it looks ridiculous. They're going to fall into a higher B tier for me. The first method of public transport into A tier is going to be both passenger and intercity trains. The only reason this doesn't make S tier because each train holds 240 people, which is a lot of sims, and it's great for moving them around. If you're moving through the milestones, you don't unlock trains until the small city milestone, and to get them integrated into the rest of your city at that point, once you've already got so much stuff laid out, can be a little bit awkward and usually involves ripping out a lot of infrastructure, which for me brings its score down. But there are a ton of things you can do with trains, which is why it ranks so highly. There are a lot of public transport hubs that use trains really effectively. You can combine them with metro and monorail and loads of other methods to get people moving around the city. And then they are, of course, the second best way of bringing tourists into the city via intercity trains. You will probably notice here that I've excluded cargo trains and also cargo ships from this list. Even though they do fall under the public transport tab, they're not strictly public transport, they're, I guess, industrial transport, so they're excluded from this list. And trains can also be quite difficult to use as well if you have little experience with them. You'll come across quite a lot of train traffic if you start to mix internal and intercity train lines and cargo trains all on the same line. So it's important that we separate each of these three different types of train out onto their own lines. Another gripe that also brings trains down slightly on the list is the fact that when you're placing large train transport hubs that do accept intercity trains, so I'm referring to the stations that have multiple platforms here, every time you place the asset, the platform that accepts intercity trains will change. This is super annoying, and because of that, it brings its score down slightly as well. But again, because it unlocks so late at the small city milestone, this can be a little bit awkward to do. So for those reasons, it keeps it out of S tier, but still a strong A tier for the train systems in the game. The next method of public transport into A tier is going to be airports. So there are several types of airport in the game, but there's only one that comes with the base game. I would highly suggest grabbing the Sunset Harbour DLC and the After Dark DLC that add the Metropolitan Airport and International Airport respectively. The only reason airports aren't into S tier is because they're strictly an external method of public transport and we can't actually draw in our own plane lines. Given the restrictions of the game, especially on the console edition where you only have 9 tiles, this does make sense. You wouldn't really fly 9 tiles. But maybe in Cities Skylines 2, we can hope for internal airlines, which will be quite cool. Each external plane will hold a capacity of 200 passengers, which is actually less than an intercity train. But I'm counting air travel as the best way to bring tourists into the city is because planes don't really create traffic. You do have to factor in intercity train traffic. So that's why I'm counting air travel as the best way of bringing tourists into the city. There are some really nice things you can do combining airport assets together. I'm particularly proud of the airport that we built in Palaven, and a lot of the other cities content creators have put together some really cool airport builds, including Biffa and Imperator. They have some great ideas of what you can do with these assets, so do go and check them out. And very similar to the cruise liner terminal, it's almost essential that we include internal public transport right next to our airport so we don't get 200 sims leaving the planes and all of them driving. That will choke our roads. So for me, the best way of bringing in tourists and a very strong A-tier contender for the airports. We're now going to move into the realm of S-tier public transport, and it's pretty clear which ones these are going to be. So we'll start out with the first one. This is going to be cycling. Cycling is a massively overpowered mechanic in the game, and even until recently, I didn't realize how fast sims will cycle. For those following our various series, which will be linked down below and linked at the end of the video, we recently found that a sim literally cycled from one side of the map to the other using elevated bike paths. And cycling makes the After Dark DLC worth buying just for cycling. It really is that good. It also really heavily reduces the number of cars on the roads, and they're also easier to get around because they're essentially just walking paths that accept bikes. So you can be a lot more nimble with them. You have a lot more freedom in their placement as opposed to a road. You can traverse much more different terrain and much tighter gaps with Cycle Network as opposed to letting the sims drive. There are also a couple of policies that help encourage biking, including the Encourage Biking policy, funnily enough, and ban bikes on sidewalks. So there are a few different things you can do to further increase the cycle effectiveness. Establishing a strong cycle network early on in your city, you will notice a huge difference in your traffic. I can't stress how powerful cycling is, a really, really strong method of public transport. And it also looks really nice as well, seeing these sims cycle around. And from a decoration point of view, because it's a pathway, we can slightly elevate it, which looks great. And also, it's easy just to stop by other methods of public transport, including train stations, airports, bus stops, intercity bus stops. Everything that we've covered today, cycling integrates into all of them really easily. So I love Cycle Network, and for that, it falls into S tier for me. Next up into S tier is going to be Monorail. Now, the only real downside to Monorail is that it produces quite a lot of noise pollution, so you have to be careful around residential areas, but usually you can just avoid this with proper planning. They hold 180 passengers, which is the second highest behind trains for a method of internal public transport. But the thing with monorails is that they look great, they're really cool to integrate into the city. Their stations can be placed next to a road, or there's a version of the station with a road passing through it, which makes them really easy to integrate into high dense areas. You don't have to plan a station to sit on the side of the road. Similar to a bike network, their tracks are really easy to place because they're so narrow and small. You can get some really nice kind of bendy curves with them to make them look really nice. And there's also a version of the tracks that goes above the road as well, making it a much easier method of public transport to integrate into your city alongside your high density areas as well. Just because of the nature of Monorail, it has quite a sci-fi look which can tie really nicely into some builds, especially with the high-tech content creator pack. And it's also really cool to bring into amusement parks again as well, similar to cable cars, integrating them into parks and seeing them pass over different areas. Really good, love Monorail, and it certainly makes the mass transit DLC that it comes with worth buying. So one of my favourite methods and a very strong S tier contender for the Monorail. Next up into S tier is going to be Metro. With the Sunset Harbour patch, we got an addition of Overground Metro, which was, I think, Paradox's take on the Overground Metro mod. I'm not massively familiar with my mods, but I think it was inspired by that, and they maybe even worked with the mod creator. That could be wrong. But Metro is super easy to integrate into the city, primarily because it's mostly underground, but we can, of course, now use it overground. But there are so many different vibes you can take this with. We ran it through kind of wheat fields before, which looks really nice. You can run it in loops around your high density areas, which keeps everyone moving around. Lots of public transport hubs come with Metro integrated into them, like the Metropolitan Airport and the Monorail Metro train hub. It's just a very accessible method of public transport and super easy to integrate into already existing areas. And the train stations content creator pack added some really nice looking Metro stations, which only improves the score. And in most of my cities, Metro is usually the backbone that overtakes buses once the city is a little more established and the budget can support a significant Metro network. And it's always really nice seeing so many Sims spill out of the stations. Super satisfying. And of course, for me, the most interesting asset to sit and watch in the game is the Metro Plaza that comes with the content creator pack. Super nice looking asset, and you could sit here and watch this thing for absolutely hours. So when I'm building a public transport network, Metro is absolutely my go-to, alongside Monorail and cycling. So a very strong S tier for Metro. And of course, the last addition into S tier, and the absolute definition of yes please, is going to be Trams. For those that follow my channel, we absolutely live for trams, also known as streetcars or light rail. I think a lot of people call them quite different things. Wonderful public transport. They're a nice intermediary option for the city between unlocking buses and metro, but that's only one small bonus of them. They are super easy to detail, probably the most detailable, if that's a word, method of public transport. Because they can separate out onto their tram-only tracks, you can run these through Greenbelt, really heavily decorate them, integrate them a number of ways into the city. You can elevate these lines, run them through Greenbelt, separate them off main arterial roads, and flesh out around them with park life assets. They also hold 90 people, which is 3 times as many as a bus, and only slightly less than the metro as well. You also don't have to worry about them being hampered by poor road conditions and snow if you're playing with a snowfall map. And they also look great as well. I think I probably would have placed trolley buses higher if trolley bus also had a trolley bus only track, but unfortunately it doesn't. So I absolutely love trams. We've integrated them in a number of different ways across my different series, and I think everyone seems to get on board with the way that I use trams. I think you can definitely tell that they're my personal favourite method of public transport, and for me they absolutely are the only reason to buy the Snowfall DLC, unless you like playing with that relentless white and total lack of colour in the snow maps. So trams are going to complete a very solid S tier public transport for me. Okay guys, that is going to do it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this type of tiered video and would like to see more on some different themes in Cities Skylines, please do let me know what themes down below in the comments. I'm quite happy to make these, they're really fun to make, and if you guys enjoy them, then we'll definitely do more of them. If not, you'll never see them again. So just let me know if you enjoyed it or not. If you're interested in checking out the city that we've flown around today, this Boreal themed city right here is Palaven, my vanilla Cities Skylines Let's Play. It is linked down below and at the end of the video. And likewise, when we hopped into the snow cities, look at the cruise terminals, that is Novaria, my vanilla snow city, which is currently an ongoing series. Also linked down below and at the end of the video. Just want to say a huge thank you for all the support on the channel, but otherwise I will shut up and leave it there. And thank you all so much for watching. And as always, enjoy the rest of your day.